The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper, but with a faint, staticky hum that seemed to emanate from the fillings in your teeth. Dr. Eris Thorne felt it first in his lab, a deep thrumming resonance that made the delicate chronometers on his workbench tremble out of sync, their atomic hearts suddenly beating to a discordant rhythm. For weeks, the anomaly had been a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the global data streams that only he and a handful of other fringe physicists seemed to notice. A subtle and persistent desynchronization of time itself, infinitesimally small drifts that accumulated like dust in the corners of reality. He'd called it temporal dissociative resonance, a name his superiors at the DARPA-funded institute had dismissed as fanciful, preferring to label the global satellite clock malfunctions as a sophisticated new form of cyber warfare. But Eris knew it was something else, something deeper. He saw it in the way coffee swirled in his mug a fraction of a second before he stirred it, in the momentary double vision of a bird in flight, its wings occupying 2 points in space at once. The universe, it seemed, was developing a stutter. Then came the disappearances, small at first, lost keys that were never truly lost, just temporarily displaced, then pets that vanished from locked rooms, and then the first person, a janitor in Des Moines who simply ceased to be midway through mopping a floor, leaving behind a fading heat signature and a janitorial cart that rolled to a stop against a wall that no longer remembered him. The world's media called it a rash of strange missing person cases, but Eris, tracking the desynchronization spikes, saw a pattern, a series of excisions from the fabric of space-time, as neat and clean as a surgeon's cut. The hum grew louder, no longer a phantom in the background, but a constant, nauseating buzz at the edge of hearing, and with it came the chittering. It was a sound that defied description, a chorus of a billion clicking insects mixed with the crackle of breaking glass and the wet tearing of fabric, and it seemed to pour from the places where reality was thinnest. It was the sound of unraveling. The first major breach occurred in Chicago, not as an attack, but as a sickening bloom of non-existence. Eris watched on a live satellite feed from the Colorado command bunker, his theories now frantically, horrifyingly relevant. The city didn't burn or crumble. It glitched. Skyscrapers flickered, their steel and glass facades momentarily transparent, revealing the ghost-like grid of their internal structures before snapping back into place, slightly altered, a window misplaced, a spire bent at an impossible angle. People on the streets would freeze, their forms becoming a pixelated smear of color and light for a terrifying second before either reforming or vanishing entirely, their screams dissolving into the omnipresent chittering. The military response was swift, predictable, and utterly useless. F-22 Raptors screamed across the sky toward the epicenter near Grant Park. But as they crossed the invisible perimeter of the bloom, they simply ceased to be. No explosion, no wreckage, just an abrupt end to their radar signature and a lingering Doppler effect that hung in the air like a question mark. An entire armored column rolling down the I-90 was unwritten from the world. The pavement they had occupied moments before pristine and unscarred, as if they had never been conceived. They were fighting a negative, an absence, a force that didn't destroy but erased, and it was consuming one of America's largest cities, block by agonizing block. It's not destroying them. General, it's decoring them. Eris tried to explain, his voice hoarse, gesturing at a complex waveform on his monitor that showed the city's quantum signature collapsing into chaotic noise. Their fundamental state, their history, is being overwritten with nothing. It's weaponized entropy. The general, A man named Harker, with a face carved from granite and disbelief, just stared at the main screen where a section of the Willis Tower was slowly dissolving into a shimmering cloud of static. He understood force and firepower, not quantum mechanics, and the weaponized entropy of the chittering hegemony, as Eris had dubbed the unseen foe, was beyond his comprehension. Hope was a dying currency in the bunker, sold off with every failed countermeasure, every squadron that blinked out of existence. The Chicago bloom was expanding, the chittering sound now audible on the live feeds, a sound that made hardened analysts weep and claw at their ears. It was the end, Eris thought, a quiet, computational death for humanity, erased by cosmic auditors who had found a rounding error in the equation of their existence. And then, amidst the chaos and despair on the screen, something new appeared. It wasn't a ship or a soldier in any recognizable sense. It was a flicker of light in the heart of the glitching city, a point of impossible coherence in the entropic storm. It solidified into a form, vaguely humanoid but fluid, crafted from solidified moonlight and captured lightning. It moved with a grace that broke the laws of motion, striding through the unreality as if it were solid ground. A second figure materialized beside the first, this one burning with the cool, blue fire of a gas flame, its limbs trailing ribbons of distorted time. Eris leaned closer to the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The chittering hegemony seemed to notice them, the static of their presence momentarily intensifying, the chittering rising to a fever pitch as several fractal-like voids of pure nothingness converged on the two figures. The first being, the one of moonlight, raised a hand. It did not fire a weapon. It simply gestured, and the timeline buckled. A building that had been half erased, its upper floors a memory of steel and dust, snapped back into perfect, pristine existence. The voids of nothingness that had been rushing forward were suddenly caught in a temporal loop, endlessly repeating the first few feet of their advance, trapped like insects in amber. The second figure, the blue flame, swept an arm in a wide arc. Where his hand passed, reality was not just restored, but reinforced. A group of panicked civilians who had been flickering on the verge of erasure solidified, their faces etched with a confusion that was infinitely better than the terror that had been there a moment before. Soldiers who had vanished from a barricade reappeared, stumbling but whole, their memories hazy, as if waking from a dream. These beings, these echoes, as a name bloomed unbidden in Eris's mind, weren't fighting the hegemony. They were editing it out, correcting its influence, pasting over the damage with strokes of temporal energy. An M1 Abrams tank that had been reduced to a shimmering outline reappeared, its engine roaring back to life. The echoes moved through the chaos of the Chicago bloom like calm but focused artists restoring a masterpiece that a vandal had tried to shred. They were silent, their actions precise, their power overwhelming. The chittering faltered, the sound of confident destruction replaced by something that sounded almost like frustration, a dissonant shriek of static and rage. From his vantage point in the bunker, surrounded by the stunned silence of generals and technicians, Eris Thorne watched as these impossible saviors began to push the nothingness back, weaving the frayed edges of the world back together with threads of light and time. He saw a third echo appear, a being that seemed to be made of shattered reflections, and as it turned, just for a moment, he thought he saw a human face within the kaleidoscope of light, a face etched with a sorrow as ancient as the stars. Humanity was not alone, but its saviors were not angels or aliens. They were ghosts from a future that should not exist, fighting a war in the past to save their own memory. And in that terrifying, beautiful paradox, Eris found the first, fragile shard of hope. The silence in the Colorado bunker was a physical thing, a heavy blanket of disbelief that smothered the usual background noise of cooling fans and quiet chatter. General Harker stood frozen, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a technician's chair, his gaze locked on the main screen where the shimmering, moonlight-forged being was calmly restitching a city bus back into existence from a cloud of chaotic data. The bus reappeared with a solidity that felt more real than the original, its metal gleaming, its tires perfectly inflated, a discarded newspaper on one of its seats now legible where before it had been a blur. Harker finally let out a breath, a ragged, incredulous sound. "What in God's name are they?" he rasped, his voice a low growl that failed to conceal the tremor of awe running through it. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding Eris across the room. The question was not for the room. It was a direct, desperate demand aimed at the one man who had been speaking this new, terrifying language of temporal physics. "I called them echoes," Eris replied, his own voice barely a whisper, his eyes glued to his personal monitor where he was frantically trying to analyze the energy signatures. The data was nonsensical, beautiful, and terrifying. It wasn't energy in any conventional sense, not electromagnetic, not kinetic, not nuclear. It was potential, pure causality, being wielded like a tool. They appeared to be stabilized, coherent temporal phenomena, beings, for lack of a better word, that can manipulate the local timeline. They aren't just rebuilding Chicago, General. They're reasserting its history against an active attempt to delete it. On the screen, the blue flame echo drifted through a still flickering office building, and as it passed, lights turned on in its wake. Computer monitors booted up showing half-written emails, and a pot of coffee on a warmer began to steam again, the liquid reforming from a state of dissipated heat and vapor. They were not merely reversing the damage, they were negating the very act of its occurrence. The chittering hegemony's erasure was being itself erased, a double negative that resulted in a positive, but a positive that was subtly different. Cleaner, as if reality had been run through a defragmentation program. The world's attention was riveted on Chicago. News helicopters that dared not enter the airspace broadcast grainy, long-distance footage. Global networks, having abandoned all other news, were simply streaming the military's satellite feed, accompanied by the stunned, babbling commentary of anchors who had run out of superlatives for unbelievable. The hegemony, however, was not a passive force. The initial shock of this unexpected resistance seemed to pass, and its tactics shifted. The entropic bloom stopped its outward expansion and began to coalesce, the random erasure of city blocks replaced by a focused, intelligent malevolence. The chittering sound from the audio feeds intensified, losing its chaotic, insect-like quality and sharpening into a single, piercing frequency, a focused note of anti-existence, voids of nothingness, darker and more defined than before, began to form not on buildings, but in the space immediately surrounding the echoes. They were no longer attacking the city, they were attacking its saviors, the Moonlight Echo, which Aris's software had designated Echo Alpha, was the first target. A sphere of absolute silence and blackness materialized beside it. It wasn't a hole in space, Aris realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach. It was a pocket of localized, retroactive non-creation. The hegemony was trying to create a paradox where the echo had never existed to begin with. The echo reacted instantly. It didn't dodge or flee. It reached into the void. As its hand of solidified light touched the edge of the nothingness, a shockwave of pure information radiated outwards. Eris's screens flared white, a torrent of data flooding his sensors, not code, but raw conceptual fragments, the feeling of a first snowfall, the mathematical constant of pi, the scent of ozone after a storm, the genetic code for a dragonfly. The Echo was fighting the hegemony's nothingness by flooding it with somethingness, with the foundational data of a universe the hegemony sought to erase. The void shrieked, a sound of pure digital feedback, and collapsed in on itself. But the attack was a distraction. While Alpha was engaged, the being of shattered reflections, Echo Gamma was swarmed. A dozen smaller, faster-moving fractal voids descended on it, not attempting to erase it outright, but to destabilize its form, to sever its connection to the timeline it was defending. For a horrifying moment, the kaleidoscopic being began to glitch, its form flickering violently, its mirrored surfaces showing not reflections of Chicago, but of other places, other times. A flash of a primeval jungle under a purple sun, a glimpse of a city made of crystalline towers humming with unheard music, a desert of red sand littered with the colossal bones of creatures that had never walked the earth. And then, for a single soul-crushing frame that was burned into Eris's mind, a vision of a dying earth, its skies the color of rust, its oceans evaporated into salt flats, and a handful of ghostly, translucent figures, humanoid in shape, huddled around a colossal, ring-like machine that pulsed with a faint, sorrowful light. It was a memory, not the Echo's memory, Eris knew instinctively, but the memory of the consciousness within the Echo. It was the moment of their creation, a last, desperate act of a dying species to send their very essence, their final at the sand collective memory, back in time to save their own past. They weren't ghosts from the future. They were the future. They were the final remnants of humanity, encoded into temporal energy, fighting a retroactive war for their own conception. The revelation hit Eris with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled back from his console, his hand going to his mouth. "They're us," he whispered. "Oh, God, they're us." Harker shot him a sharp look, but his attention was pulled back to the screen. The assault on Echo Gamma had cost it. A sliver of its form, a shard of reflected light, broke free and dissolved into the chittering static. The Echo recoiled, its form dimmer, less defined. It had been wounded, and the hegemony pressed its advantage, the piercing shriek of its presence intensifying. But it had made a mistake. In wounding one, it had enraged the others. Echo Beta, the being of blue flame, which had been methodically restoring the city's infrastructure, erupted. It abandoned its work and streaked across the sky. No longer a calm flame, but a raging temporal inferno. It didn't attack the voids, it attacked the medium they traveled through. It began to burn time itself. The air around the hegemony's fractal attackers began to visibly warp, aging and de-aging at a ferocious rate. A single second would stretch into 1,000 years, then compress back into a nanosecond. The voids, creatures of precise, linear erasure, were caught in a storm of temporal chaos they could not process. They flickered, their forms becoming unstable, and one by one, they tore themselves apart, undone by the very temporal mechanics they sought to weaponize. The chittering scream of the hegemony reached a crescendo of pain and fury, and then, as if a switch had been flipped, it vanished. The bloom of entropy dissipated like smoke in the wind. The piercing frequency cut to silence. The remaining voids imploded, and the sky over Chicago was, for the first time in 12 hours, clear. The city was saved. but it was irrevocably scarred, not with craters and rubble, but with the subtle wounds of a restored timeline. A street sign that read Michigan Avenue in a font that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. A flock of pigeons in Grant Park that flew backwards. A woman who looked at her husband and saw the face of a man she had never met, yet loved with all her heart. The city was whole, but it was haunted by the echoes of its own unmaking. The three saviors hovered for a moment over the center of the city. Echo Gamma was noticeably diminished, its light flickering weakly. Echo Alpha gently drifted towards it, extending a hand of moonlight that seemed to shore up its wavering form. Then, all three turned their featureless faces upwards, directly at the satellite that fed the world its image of the battle. There was no mistaking the intent. They knew they were being watched. They had always known. The knowledge settled into the bunker with a chilling weight. This wasn't a rescue. It was a demonstration. Then, as one, the echoes dissolved, not with a bang or a flash, but by simply fading back into the normal flow of time, leaving behind nothing but a lingering scent of ozone and the impossible, undeniable fact of a saved city. The world outside the bunker erupted into a cacophony of celebration and confusion, but inside, a new, colder reality set in. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even truly begun. That was just a skirmish, a test. The hegemony had been repelled, not defeated. Eris, his mind still reeling from the vision of the dying Earth, looked at his screen, which were now filled with the temporal residue left by the echoes. It was a new kind of radiation, a new field of science born in a single afternoon. General Harker walked over to him, his face grim, the earlier awe replaced by the hard pragmatism of a lifelong soldier facing a new and incomprehensible battlefield. He placed a heavy hand on Eris's shoulder. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice devoid of any uncertainty. "They're us. You said, I don't know what that means. I don't care. What I do know is that they are the only weapon we have in a war we don't understand. I want to know everything about them, where they came from, what they want, and how we can point them at the next target. Your lab now has unlimited funding and priority, one clearance. Find a way to talk to them. Find a way to bring them back. Because whatever that was, it's coming for us again. And next time, it won't be testing the waters." The world did not breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath. The Chicago Miracle, as the media dubbed it, was not a clean victory. It was the revelation of a new and terrible chessboard upon which humanity was merely a pawn. In the weeks that followed, a strange, quiet panic settled over the globe, a collective anxiety born from the knowledge that reality was a negotiable contract. The stock market didn't crash, it simply stopped making sense. With algorithms trying to price assets in a world where a city could be unwritten and then rewritten in an afternoon. New cults bloomed overnight. The children of the Echo performing silent, graceful dances in city parks, trying to mimic the movements of the Moonlight Savior. Science, however, was where the true revolution and terror took hold. The temporal residue left by the battle was a new fundamental force out of the universe that had been hiding in plain sight, and Eris Thorne was its unwilling high priest. His new home, officially designated the Advanced Temporal Mechanics Directorate, but known to its staff simply as the Echo Chamber, was a sprawling, subterranean complex carved into the rock beneath the Nevada desert. A place where the brightest minds Harker's black budget could poach were being assembled. Physicists worked alongside neuroscientists, linguists, and even historians, because the problem was no longer just about energy and matter. It was about information, memory, and narrative. Eris found himself living in a state of perpetual, high-functioning exhaustion, fueled by caffeine and the searing memory of that dying, rust-colored Earth he had seen through Echo Gamma's fractured consciousness. That image was the engine that drove him, the nightmare that kept him from sleeping. It wasn't a possible future. It was the default future, the one that would happen if they failed. His first directive from Harker was simple and impossible: talk to them. But how do you place a call to a being made of coherent time? You couldn't use radio waves. That was like trying to communicate with a musician by throwing rocks at their violin. The echoes didn't perceive the universe moment by moment as humans did. Their vision was likely pan-temporal, seeing all of time as a single, complex object. To get their attention, you couldn't just shout into the present. You had to create a resonance, a vibration that would ring across the entire structure of space-time. And to do that, Aris knew they had to go to Chicago. The city had been placed under a strict, federally enforced quarantine, not for any biological or radiological threat, but for a conceptual one. Chicago was now a temporal wound, a place where the skin of reality, though healed, was thin and scarred. Eris and his hand-picked team entered the city in shielded vehicles that hummed with localized stasis fields, a technology reverse-engineered at a frantic pace from the faintest traces of the Echo's energy signatures. The city looked normal at first glance, but it felt wrong, like a recording of a song played a single microtone flat. The temporal anomalies were everywhere, subtle and deeply unsettling. Pigeons in Millennium Park would launch into the air, fly a perfect looping arc, then land precisely where they had started, their motions a flawless palindrome. The Chicago River sometimes flowed with the ghostly, superimposed image of the river as it had been a century ago, filled with steamships and industrial runoff. The most disturbing phenomena were the memory glitches. People would have vivid, unshakable recollections of events that had never happened, or they would forget loved ones for minutes at a time, only for the memory to rush back with a disorienting, painful jolt. Chicago was a city suffering from a collective, low-grade concussion of the soul. Eris's lead collaborator on this expedition was Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant, acerbic woman whose official field was cosmological data analysis, but who privately called herself a cosmic archaeologist. While Eris saw physics as equations and forces, Lena saw it as a story. She believed the cosmic microwave background radiation was the universe's fossil record, and she had spent her life learning to read the faint, informational patterns of creation itself. They didn't leave radiation, Eris, she explained, her gloved fingers brushing over a patch of pavement in Grant Park that shimmered with a faint, silvery sheen. They left a narrative echo. A piece of their story is imprinted on this place. We're not looking for a signal. We're looking for a theme. She was right. Their instruments, designed to detect energy, were picking up very little. But the conceptual analyzers, the ones that mapped informational density and causal relationships, were going haywire. The temporal residue was strongest where the fighting had been fiercest, where the echoes had poured the most of themselves into holding reality together. At the base of the Willis Tower, where Echo Alpha had dueled with the hegemony's void, Lena's devices isolated a coherent, repeating pattern. It wasn't a sound or an image, it was a pure, abstract concept that their translation software struggled to render into language. The closest approximation was a feeling the profound sorrow of a memory of a thing that has not yet been lost, but will be. It was the emotional signature of the echoes. It's grief, Lena whispered, her face pale in the glow of her tablet. They're broadcasting their own grief for us, for their own past selves. This is how they see us, as a tragedy that has already happened. Eris felt a cold dread mix with a sudden, electrifying understanding. "That's it," he said, his mind racing. "That's the frequency. It's not a radio frequency. It's a conceptual one. An emotional one. They didn't respond to our military. They responded to the erasure of a city, to the threat of oblivion. We can't call them with technology. We have to call them with meaning. Back in the Nevada desert, they began to construct the resonator. It wasn't a transmitter, but a massive spherical chamber lined with quantum entanglement arrays and psionic amplifiers, all centered on a single isolated human subject. The goal was not to send a message, but to amplify a single powerful human thought, a single conceptual note, and broadcast its resonance across the timeline, hoping the echoes would feel the vibration. But as they worked, the hegemony returned. This time, there was no bloom of entropy, no chittering sound. The attack was silent, subtle, and infinitely more terrifying. It began with small things. A technician in the echo chamber looked at a schematic for a temporal stabilizer and found that the Lorentz transformations, a cornerstone of physics for over a century, were written incorrectly. He corrected them, confused, only to have a colleague look at the new equations and declare them nonsense. A frantic check of every physics textbook and digital archive on the planet revealed a terrifying truth. Half the world remembered the equations one way, and the other half remembered them the other. History was next. General Harker was briefing the president when he referred to the pivotal Battle of Stalingrad. The president, a history major, looked at him with utter confusion. "What battle?" he asked. "The Nazis won the Eastern Front in 42. Everyone knows that." A check of the records confirmed the president's memory. The world had split. Two distinct, contradictory timelines were now superimposed, coexisting in the minds of the population. The hegemony was not erasing cities. It was erasing consensus. It was unwriting the shared history and science that held human civilization together, turning their greatest strength, their collective knowledge, into a weapon against them. The chaos was immediate. Alliances fractured. Scientific collaboration ground to a halt as researchers found themselves working from fundamentally different laws of physics. The world was being gaslit on a planetary scale. "It's a brilliant strategy, Sai," Lena said, her voice tight with a mixture of horror and professional admiration. "They're not destroying the house. They're corrupting the blueprints so it collapses on its own. They're erasing the very tools we need to understand them, to fight them." The project took on a desperate, frantic urgency. They were in a race to build their resonator before the very concept of science was erased from the collective human consciousness. Eris knew he had to be the subject. The vision the echoes had given him, the grief and sorrow he had felt, was the key. He had to become the tuning fork. He was sealed inside the spherical chamber, the hum of the machinery around him a low, constant prayer. In the control room, Lena watched his vital signs and the informational output. "We're ready, Eris," she said over the comm. "Focus on the vision. Focus on what you felt. The loss, the desperation, the last, impossible act of hope that created them. You have to become the memory they're fighting to save." Eris closed his eyes. He pushed aside the noise of the fracturing world, the fear, the pressure. He reached deep inside himself, past the physicist, past the man, and found the raw, primal image of the dying earth. He saw the rust-colored sky, the salt flats where oceans used to be. He saw the translucent, ghostly figures of the last humans. He felt their collective despair, a weight of 1 billion lost lives, 1 trillion forgotten dreams. But then he focused on the machine they were building, the ring of light, their final, insane gamble, And in that despair, he felt it a single defiant spark. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, something forged in the face of absolute extinction. It was the will to have ever existed at all. He held on to that feeling, that raw, conceptual anchor, and screamed it into the machine with the full force of his consciousness. On Lena's screens, the output flatlined, then exploded in a cascade of pure, coherent conceptual data. The entire facility hummed, the lights flickering, as the resonator fired Eris's silent, emotional scream not into space, but into time itself. For a long moment, nothing happened. The hum faded. The facility's power stabilized. Lena's heart sank. It had failed. But then a single soft chime echoed through the control room. It came from a passive sensor array, one designed to do nothing but listen to the deep background noise of the universe. A new pattern had appeared in the cosmic microwave background. It was faint, elegant, and impossibly ancient. It was a perfect, repeating waveform that, when translated into sound, became a three-note melody. And when translated into mathematics, it became a simple, elegant equation that unified quantum mechanics and general relativity, an equation that humanity had been searching for since Einstein. It was a response. It was a key. It was a gift. And deep within the chamber, Eris Thorn, unconscious, his mind adrift in the temporal currents he had unleashed, saw three figures of light coalescing in the darkness before him, their forms clearer, closer, and more solid than ever before. Their call had been answered. Eris awoke to the sound of a perfectly tuned bell, a note that seemed to resonate not in his ears, but directly in the bones of his skull. He was still in the resonator chamber, but it was no longer a machine of cold steel and humming arrays. The spherical room was now a cathedral of soft, pearlescent light, and the air itself felt thick with information, like breathing in the pages of an infinite library. He was not alone. The three echoes stood before him, not as distant figures on a screen, but as present, tangible beings. The moonlight of Alpha, the cool flame of Beta, the shattered reflections of Gamma. They were here, and their communication was not in words, but in a direct, conceptual transfer. A pure stream of understanding poured directly into his consciousness. He learned their name for the hegemony, the static, the great unraveling. They were not a civilization or a species. They were a dynamic principle of the universe, a form of cosmic nihilism given a terrible, predatory intelligence. They did not conquer. They simplified. They believed existence was an unnecessarily complex and flawed state, and their goal was to return everything to the clean, simple silence of non-being. They were the universe's self-destruct mechanism, and they had, in some unknowable way, become sentient. He learned that the echoes were not just the future of humanity. They were humanity's final, distilled argument for its own existence. They were a question mark fired back at the period at the end of all things. The dying humans of that rust-colored future had not built a time machine. They had transformed themselves into a living equation, a self-sustaining paradox designed to reinforce the timeline that the static sought to erase. The gift they had embedded in the cosmic microwave background was not just a unified theory of physics, it was a grammar, a set of rules for how to speak the language of reality. It was the knowledge of how to make matter matter more, how to reinforce an object's history and make it causally heavier, and thus more difficult for the static to unwrite. They had not given humanity a weapon. They had given them the knowledge to forge their own shield. When Eris was finally released from the chamber, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light of the debriefing room, he was a changed man. The world seemed slow, muted, its colors less vibrant than the pure concepts he had just experienced. He looked at Lena and Harker and saw not just their present forms, but the faint, shimmering after-images of their pasts and the branching, uncertain possibilities of their futures. "They answered," he said, his voice raspy. "The war has changed. We were fighting with fists in the dark. Now they've taught us how to build a lantern." The equation was the greatest scientific breakthrough in history, and it was achieved in a matter of hours. Under Lena's frantic direction, teams of scientists, now working from a single, unified set of physical laws that healed the conceptual schism, began to translate the Echo's gift into technology. The first device was a causal anchor. It was a humming, cylindrical machine that, when activated, generated a localized field where the probability of an object's continued existence was amplified to near certainty. Inside the field, an object's past was locked in place, its narrative reinforced 1,000-fold. It could still be physically destroyed, but it could not be conceptually erased. Harker immediately ordered the construction of a massive anchor around the entire Nevada facility. "If they can corrupt the laws of physics," he'd barked, "they can damn well corrupt the ground under our feet. I want this entire complex to be the most historically undeniable piece of real estate on the planet." Mobile versions were rushed into production, designed to shield tanks, command centers, and cities. Humanity had its shield, but the static was intelligent, and it adapted. It recognized that a frontal assault on a heavy target was now inefficient. So it changed its tactics from a widespread assault on history to a precision strike against the man who had become the fulcrum of humanity's defense. The attacks on Eris were insidious, quiet, and devastatingly personal. It started with his memories. One morning, he woke up with no recollection of his mother's face. He could access the data, her name, her date of birth, photos of her, but the emotional connection, the warm, sensory memory of her smile, was gone, replaced by a cold, black void. The static was not just erasing his history, it was stealing his soul. One piece at a time, he would be in the middle of a complex calculation, and the memory of the professor who had taught him advanced calculus would vanish, leaving him staring at the equations as if they were alien glyphs. They were deconstructing him from the inside out, erasing the foundational experiences that had shaped the mind capable of communicating with the echoes. He became a ghost in his own life, haunted by the absences of things he could no longer remember loving. Lena watched in horror as the man she respected began to fray at the edges. "They're pruning him," she told Harker, her voice trembling with rage. "They're trying to retroactively create a version of Eris Thorne who was never brilliant enough, never empathetic enough, to make contact. If they succeed, the echoes may never have been contacted in the first place, and the equation will vanish. They're attacking the entire timeline through one man's past." The final assault came without warning. Eris was in his lab, trying to focus on a new schematic, when a wave of nausea washed over him. The objects in the room, the beakers, the monitors, his own hands began to flicker. He was becoming decoherent, his quantum signature destabilizing as the static launched a direct, overwhelming attack on his personal timeline. He felt his memories dissolving like sugar in water, his first kiss, the pride of graduation, the smell of his childhood home, all unraveling into meaningless static. He was being hollowed out, his entire life being overwritten with a null value. "Lena!" he managed to gasp, his voice a distorted echo. In the control room, alarms shrieked. Eris's biodata was collapsing into chaos. They're erasing him now in real time, a technician yelled. Activate the anchor now. Lena screamed, slamming her fist on the console. Harker was already a step ahead, his voice cutting through the panic on the command channel. Divert all primary power to the lab's localized causal anchor. Full power. I don't care if the lights go out everywhere else. Deep in the facility's core, massive capacitors discharged with a bone-jarring thud. The lights in the complex flickered and died, plunging everyone into emergency backup lighting. In Eris's lab, the cylindrical anchor in the corner glowed with an intense silver light, and a shimmering, almost invisible field of energy snapped into existence around the room. Inside the bubble of reinforced reality, the flickering stopped. Eris collapsed to his knees, gasping, his form solid and whole again. The attack had been repelled, his history locked down just moments before it was completely unwritten. He was safe, a prisoner in a sanctuary of his own design. But as the adrenaline faded, a new, chilling sensation crept into his consciousness. The attack had been precise, intimate, targeting memories no one else could have known. And the energy of the static's assault, it hadn't felt like it was coming from across the void of space. The psychic pressure, the cold, nihilistic intent, it had felt close, terribly close. He looked up, his strange, new perception cutting through the walls of the lab, through the rock of the mountain. He could feel the faint, lingering trail of the static's conceptual energy, and it wasn't leading out into the cosmos. The trail led deeper into the facility, down into the most secure levels of the echo chamber itself. Lena, he said into his comm, his voice low and steady with a newfound, terrifying certainty. The attack didn't come from the outside. It was amplified from inside the base. The static, it isn't just coming for us. It's already here. The revelation sent a shockwave of cold paranoia through the echo chamber. The enemy was inside the wire. The static was not an external force, but a conceptual virus. And someone within humanity's most secure facility was a carrier, a patient zero for the unraveling of reality itself. Harker immediately locked the facility down, transforming their sanctuary into a gilded cage. No one in, no one out. Every person, from the top-tier scientists to the janitorial staff, was a suspect. Trust, the fundamental currency of collaboration, evaporated overnight, replaced by suspicion and fear. Eris, his mind now a strange hybrid of human intuition and the echo's pan-temporal perception, became the sole investigator in a crime that defied all conventional forensics. He couldn't look for fingerprints or DNA. He had to look for the subtle corruption of causality, for the faint, discordant hum of a timeline that had been tampered with. He walked through the sterile corridors of the base, his gaze distant, seeing not just people, but the shimmering, complex tapestry of their personal histories. He was looking for a thread that was out of place, a color that was wrong, a knot that betrayed a hidden edit. The traitor, he realized, wouldn't even know what they were. The static didn't recruit agents. It infected them. It would find a mind susceptible to nihilism, to despair, a person whose own internal narrative was weak, and it would latch on, turning their subconscious into a resonance point, an amplifier for its will. They would be a walking, talking antenna for the end of all things. Their every resentful thought, every moment of doubt, unknowingly feeding the enemy. His search led him to Lena. It was a conclusion his heart refused to accept, but the evidence was undeniable. Her timeline, when he focused on it, was subtly frayed at the edges. Her past was too perfect, is too clean. The tragic death of her parents in a car crash as a child, The event that had driven her to seek order in the chaos of the cosmos, it felt scripted. It was too neat a narrative, a backstory too perfectly engineered to create the brilliant, driven woman who stood before him. The static had not just infected her, it had edited her past, turning her entire life into a weapon aimed at the heart of their operation. He confronted her in the main control room, the causal anchor humming softly in the background, a silent guardian against the very corruption he was about to expose. "It's you, Lena," he said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that echoed the grief of the echoes themselves. "It's been you all along." Lena stared at him, her face a mask of confusion and hurt. "Eris, what are you talking about? The pressure is getting to you." "Your parents," he said softly. "The car crash. It never happened." For a moment, she looked at him as if he were insane. Then, a flicker of something dark and ancient passed behind her eyes. The air in the room grew cold. The humming of the anchor faltered, a discordant note entering its steady tone. The static, sensing its host was discovered, began to push back. "You're a fool, Eris," she or the thing speaking through her hissed, her voice a layered, chittering sound that was horribly familiar. "You think you can save this messy, pointless little anomaly called life? All of this striving, all of this pain, for what? A few brief moments of light before an eternity of silence. We offer a cleaner solution, a universal peace." The room began to flicker, the causal anchor straining against the focused will of the static pouring through Lena. She was a singularity of anti-existence, and the entire facility was beginning to decohere around her. Harker and his men burst in, their weapons raised, but they were useless against a woman who could unwrite the history of the bullets in their magazines. "I can't fight her, Eris," Harker yelled, his face a grimace of effort as he tried to resist the wave of conceptual erasure washing over them. "You have to do something." Eris knew Harker was right. He couldn't outthink the static, and he couldn't overpower it. But the echoes had taught him one final lesson. The static's weakness was its own philosophy. It could only erase, it could not create. It fed on nihilism, but it was starved by meaning, and he couldn't save the facility, not with the static's anchor point inside it. But he could perform one last, desperate act of creation. He closed his eyes, ignoring the chaos, and reached out with his mind, not to the echoes in the past, but to the source of their power, the final, defiant act of the last humans in that dying, rust-colored future. He didn't just remember their sacrifice, he chose to make it. He poured his entire consciousness, his every memory, his love for a world the static deemed worthless, into a single and focused point. He was not sending a message, he was becoming one. "Lena," he said, his voice now calm and clear, cutting through the chittering chaos. He opened his eyes, and they shone with the reflected light of 1,000,000,000 dying stars in one indomitable act of hope. "You are not a weapon, you are a story, and every story deserves to be told." He pushed his will forward, not as an attack, but as a gift. He flooded her timeline not with force, but with meaning. He didn't try to erase the static's edits, he wrote over them. He poured into her the memory of a childhood she'd never had, of loving parents, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of a life filled with pointless, beautiful, chaotic moments. He gave her a history worth fighting for. For a moment, two realities warred within her. The chittering static fought against the memory of a father's laugh. The cold nihilism battled the warmth of a mother's embrace. Her face contorted in agony, and a shriek of pure, conceptual conflict tore through the room. The static, faced with a narrative of love and belonging, it could not comprehend, was being poisoned by it. Then, with a final, shuddering gasp, Lena collapsed. The chittering stopped. The flickering of the room stabilized. The causal anchor whirred back to its steady, protective hum. The static's presence, its anchor point in their reality severed, was gone. Eris fell to his knees, the backlash of his effort leaving him drained, his mind a quiet, empty space. He had poured almost everything he was into saving her, into saving them all. Lena stirred, groaning. The real Lena, her eyes fluttering open, filled not with ancient malice, but with a deep, human confusion and a profound, echoing loss for a past she had never truly had. In the silence that followed, a soft chime once again echoed from the passive cosmic sensor, a new message from the echoes, rippling back through time from the future he had just ensured would come to pass. It was not an equation this time, or a melody. It was a single, perfect image projected into the minds of everyone in the room. It was a picture of a new Earth, not the old, scarred world, but one vibrantly, impossibly alive. Cities of crystal and light stood amidst lush, green forests. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and in the foreground, two figures stood on a hill, their faces turned to a sun that was not dying, but rising. They were the faces of Eris and Lena. The war was not over. The static, as a universal principle, could never be truly destroyed, but it had been defeated. Humanity, armed with the knowledge of the echoes and the sheer, stubborn refusal to believe their story was meaningless, had won the right to keep existing. The future was no longer a default tragedy. It was a choice. And for the first time, looking at the image of the world they would one day build, humanity chose to write its own ending. The echo of their defiance would now ring forward through time, a song of hope against the silence, ensuring that the last act of a dying species was not an ending, but a beginning.